I think the a Beasy conversation of, hey, I want to retire at 30. I think that's a really good jumping off point, because when we talk about legacies, we have to talk about champs and vice versa. These things are connected so closely that it's kind of hard to even talk about how good a player is without bringing up champs. And I that's true of any sport really, but it's especially true in Call of Duty, and it's especially weird in Call of Duty. At least pre CDL, a lot of these champs events were just randomly put in. It was not like a build up of the entire season where you get to the end of the year and it's the playoffs essentially, and you kind of get through to the NBA Finals, the Super Bowl, the World Series, whatever kind of comparison you wanted to make. It was like if the World Series happened in at the All-Star break, or if the Super Bowl happened in November. That's kind of how these things used to be, and yet champs events and champs rings have become the dominant part of the conversation when we discuss legacies. And Abizi and Simp and Shotzi, those are the players I think, correct me if I'm wrong, and we can have this conversation about like how do you gain, or how do you gauge like who has the most to gain? Like, would somebody going from 0 to 1 have more to gain than someone going 1 to 2? But I think with a BZ, Simp, and Shotzi in particular, these players have 2 rings each. Winning another ring at champs in 2025, it takes them from being these great players that everybody knows is great to, are they the greatest of all time? Those conversations start happening. I mean, I've been having those conversations with Simp, for years already, but I think it would be a lot easier to convince people. Who do you think, or I guess we should just start with these 3 players. Do you think they have the most to gain at champs, or is it another category of players?
Well, before I answer that, I will just address kind of what you were saying, and it's kind of weird to think about it uh, in this manner. But you're talking about champs previously being this like event that didn't happen at the end of the season and whatnot. That's really like ancient history at this point, because even if you look at the play, like if you look at the active players at this champs with a ring, obviously the oldest player is going to be Slasher, and he won his in Black Ops 3,
Yeah.
and that was already an end of season event.
Hmm.
So the obviously Attach would have been the one if he was uh, competing at champs this year. He would have been like the last player to win one of those champs that happened mid-season when he won an AW. So that's even just you said that, and that got me thinking that that's just something weird in itself. To we're completely essentially completely gone from that era of any active players having their rings from um, a mid-season champs as opposed to an end-of-season champs. But back to the 3 guys you mentioned there, the 2 ring guys right now, Abizi, Simp, and Shotzi. Just in case, for whatever reason, anybody listening or watching aren't aware, Crimsix, Clayster, and Karma are the 3 players with 3 rings. They're at the very top there. Um, some guys like JCap and does Crowder have 2 rings
No.
as a
Well,
coach? Okay.
as a coach, he has one. I think he has one as a coach, one as a player.
Okay. So regardless, someone like JCap, for example, could enter with a coach's ring, but we're not gonna, split hairs
Yeah.
there. Um, the big thing really is just that those people with 2 rings, they do have that opportunity to enter, illustrious territory. And looking the list of players right now with 2 rings, the only people still actually competing are Kenny and Arcides, who won't be at champs this year. But the list of players with 2 rings: Abizi, Aches, Apathy, Arcides, JCap, Kenny, Shotzi, and Simp. So that's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 players with 2 rings. So you can already obviously make the argument that Abizi, Simp, and Shotzi are, and we had this conversation last year, like they, regardless of exactly where you want to place them, that they're top 15 players all
Yeah.
time, especially with the accolades there. And that's being generous. Like you can probably make the case for them to be top 10, and in some people's eyes, Simp might already be top 5, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I think all three of them have a lot to gain in terms of legacy, but I do, laying it out as I just did numbers wise, like their legacies are already somewhat cemented. We'll get into it a little bit more, but the only way it gets tarnished, I'll say, for lack of a better word, is with a lack of a performance at these champs events in consecutive years, and that's something I marked down for like Atlanta. Obviously, Atlanta had a lackluster showing last year at champs, and it kind of got erased because they won EWC after that. Um, but for champs specifically, that was kind of a shock to see um, Atlanta struggle last year, especially in the CDL era where they've seen so much success. And on the flip side of that, someone like Shotzi and Optic last year, they obviously come into the event following a last place finish, and people were questioning what the hell is going on with that, and then they erase any doubts by winning champs. And this year hasn't gone according to plan either. Been a lot of ups and downs and whatnot. But if Optic are to win champs this year, that just completely erases basically everything that happened this year. Shotzi gets a third ring, Dashy and Hook get a second, uh, Mercules would get a first, which is just another topic in entirely of itself. But yeah, so I mean that's just the place that Champs is in terms of like rarefied air and what it means for these players' legacies in the eyes of many people. Like, you have a bad season, like, there's no way around saying it. Like, Optic have had a pretty bad season, especially in the eyes of the majority of Greenwall fans. But if they win champs here, everything that's happened before champs is irrelevant.
Yeah, so I was just looking it up. There's only been 3 players in CDL history to win back-to-back champs. No team has ever done it. So obviously, if Optic were to
Mhm.
do it, then they make history by themselves. But they would also become the fourth, fifth, and sixth and seventh players to do it. The three are Karma. Karma won the first two champs in 2013 and 2014. JCap became the second player, winning in 2015 and 2016. And then Clayster became the third and most recent player, winning 2019, which was the last CWL champs, and then 2020 winning the first CDL champs. So that would obviously put them in some really like rarefied air to go back to back, and it would kind of harken back to those days where we are talking about like where it's the mid-season tournament, because those tournaments, Denial being a good example of that, because if it had lasted till the end of the season, that team probably gets picked up by a bigger team. Like that team got poached pretty much afterward because Denial fell apart and they weren't paying their players, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm misremembering the exact Denial history because they had that later on in their history. But either way, like they get poached, they probably go to different teams. Who knows if they last until whatever it is, September, October, when they actually play champs. They were kind of like right place, right time. They were a great team, but I think it was not always going to be a long-term project for them, especially with Denial. Uh, we've seen it also, like Karma's champs are also part of that, because Impact blows up in the summer of 2013 after Anaheim, I believe, and by the end of the season, like they're not the predominant team. It's Complexity, and who knows how things could have changed, because let's say Champs is at the end of that year, Clay, Krim, Aches, TP, they probably all get their ring that year as well at the end of 2013, going into Ghosts, and the end of Champs, and or if end of Ghosts, if Champs is there, who knows how things work out then, because by that time Complexity was starting to fray as well. I believe Dido filled in for one of those events, if I'm not mistaken, when they went to EG. So I think it would be very interesting to it would show that Optic in general can like you said, erase everything that happened this season. It just doesn't matter. Like in a moment, it does not matter at all that Optic had these weird roster changes, that there was drama over Pred, getting dropped, coming back, getting dropped again, about them losing to Vegas, losing to LAG, waiting to pick up Mercules. None of this matters. Like none of it. And I think that's what's so amazing. And that's why, not to put the heritage before the course, but like I believe that Shotzi probably has the most to gain from champs because he becomes like this incredible story of like he wins his first champs in 2020 and then 2024 they look completely out of sorts. They look like they're not even competitive going into champs, and then they win it in front of their home crowd, which was kind of an amazing like experience in the arena. And then 2025 to have this horrible season as a team, you have to actually perform well at the final major to ensure that you're actually going to even get to champs, and then to win champs again. You become the only player in Optic history to win champs with them twice, because obviously before this it was only the dynasty team had champs. Well, I guess everybody on this team, or not everybody.
With Dashy.
Yeah, Dashy would have back to back, but Shotzi would also have the 2020 ring, which he was the season MVP of the 2020 season. There's just a lot on the line for him. I would, as an aside, it would definitely shut up Aches for good. Like I don't think Stephen Aches could really do anything at that point. To talk about somebody actually has more rings than him, that would have the I think he'd be the fourth player in
Yeah.
CDL history in general to have 3 rings. So it would be pretty much a groundbreaking, monumental performance for Shotzi if he were to win champs again.
I will say I think there's somebody else, and specifically in my mind, who has the most to gain, and in theory I guess has something to lose too. But of the players that we just listed here with 2 rings, I will say I think Shotzi does have the most to gain, because it does feel like, Simp and Abizi, their legacies are pretty cemented right now, that they, in a lot of people's minds, they would take a massive fall off for them to not be considered both top 10 players of all time in COD history. I feel like Shotzi is still, for whatever reason, some people could argue that's not the case for him. So a third ring would, it would be undeniable at that point.
Who do you think has more to gain in general? If Shotzi doesn't, in your mind, is there a specific player that you
Yeah,
think does have more to gain if he were to win champs this year?
I think it's Scrap. I think, especially just the way LAT have looked of recent, and the bigger thing looming in the background for Scrap is that they, with Toronto and NYSL at Champs 2023, his Toronto team won the winners finals against New York, and then they get to the grand finals against New York and they don't win a map. um it's kind of, a little similar in just in terms of the Vancouver teams this year, where they get to these finals and they haven't won a map. Obviously, it's 4 maps there. So it's a little different, and the narrative and everything isn't the same. But I think Scrap, like, especially we've had the conversation around season MVP for this year. If he gets the season MVP, he's got the regular season tournament MVPs and tournament titles. Those are starting to rack up for him. But the one that's missing is champs, and obviously it's still a young career for him, so he has time. But I do think he, like, it could enter the conversation for potentially the greatest season an individual has ever had, at least in the CDL era. If he wins champs, he would. If he gets, he's got 2 titles, 2 tournament MVPs. If he gets regular season MVP and then wins champs on top of that, that's potentially one of the greatest seasons in competitive Call of Duty history. even further or less to that degree, definitely we would be one of the greatest seasons in CDL history. Um, so I think he has a lot to gain, especially in that regard. And I do think, playing devil's advocate to that too, kind of similar to the phase guys, like, I guess it's really, you can say this for a lot of people, but like, um, especially the Phase and Atlanta guys, or sorry, I said Phase and Atlanta, Phase and LAT guys who have had that success this year. Like if they don't show up at champs, that
Yeah.
that is just another conversation in itself. So I do think scrap though, especially of those players, and I did write it down. So there's the three players that we already mentioned: Abizi, Simp, and Shotzi. They got the 2 rings. And then there are 7 players with 1 ring: Hydra, Envoy, Celium, Draza, Dashi, Hook, and Slasher, which means with 8 teams, 32 players at champs, there's 22 players, and which is roughly 69% of the players at champs who don't have a ring. And I think of those 22 players, Scrap is the one who has the most to gain, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that one of the last things that you said about like not only does he, in your opinion, have the most to gain, he has among the most to lose at this event. If he doesn't show up or if the team doesn't have the success, because I think it's very hard to believe that he's not going to have a good event. Like he's
Yeah.
one of the best players, if not the best player in the world. And I just can't see that happening. Like there might be one series that he doesn't have a great performance in, but I think in general he's going to do well. But like, let's say they don't win champs, even if they get second, then it starts to happen again where it's like, well, Silver Surfer, like you can't really win the big one. And it's something that a lot of great players have dealt with. Scump went a while without winning champs, and he was by far the best or one of the best players for 3, 4, 5 years at that point. And then they finally win in IW. I think an underrated one is Octane, because Octane was always said to be one of the most talented players, probably the best AR or second best AR, depending on where you ranked him in formal. And this was years and years and years. And he didn't end up winning until 2022 with LAT, which was near the end of his career. Dashi is another one where he even said it like that he felt he was more talented than players that were beating him in these events. And he finally wins one last season with Optic. But again, that conversation had really started to grow with Dashi, was that he's a selfish player. He just plays for stats, that he's not a winning player. And I don't think the same conversation will be had about Scrap, regardless of the results at these champs. But if you don't win it now, you only have your next chance a year from now, which is a long time. Like 12 months is a really long time to have to wait to try to win champs again. And I think it could be a pretty big blow to Scrap, and especially with him most likely going to be named MVP of the league, to not win it that year is always kind of a blow, I think, to a lot of those players. I don't know exactly how often that has happened, because Shotzi ended up winning in 2020. Simp won in 2021. I think Hydra, did he not win in, I think it was 2023 though. LAT, I know one of them did not win season MVP when they won it. So that was
Yeah.
probably the difference. But a lot of times we've seen the season MVP go on to win champs. And I think it does linger with that player at least a little bit when they're not able to pull it off at the end of the season, despite having the individual accolade to go with it. But another part of this that I think is interesting is Phase, because LAT and Phase, they are the teams that we both expect. If one of them doesn't win champs, we expect the other to win. If Atlanta doesn't win champs, it's really bad. Like they should not go on Twitter for several months if they don't win champs, because they have the Silver Surfer tagline basically tattooed on them. It seems like permanently, because they won 2 events this year. They won EWC last year. I think they even won a major last year. They have beaten LAT once in a grand finals. They've lost to them once, and yet people still doubt Atlanta and say, well, they get second a lot. They don't win a lot, or they get close to it, but they're not able to come up with the win at the end of the day. If they don't win this year, I think those players have quite a bit to lose as well. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, not even like Silver Surfer in that regard, at least specifically for champs. Like they literally got top six
Yeah.
at champs last year, and that's what I kind of mentioned. Like if something happens again, that harkens back a little to our power rankings, where I forget how exactly I worded it, but it was like anything but championship Sunday, or I wanted to do anything but grand finals, but then I didn't because like I didn't know if like those two teams would match up, whatever. Um, but yeah, like if FaZe has another, you know, catastrophic performance at champs, and in that regard, I think it's anything but making championship Sunday. That gets the wheels turning a little bit in regards to what the future of this team looks like, and I think it's fair to bring up again. Like really, that conversation happened last year. Well, we don't know if it happened actually with the team or behind closed doors, but at least from a community perspective, people were starting to wonder if this FaZe roster was going to stick. And then EWC happens and they win. And that kind of, at least from the outside looking in, seems to be like, okay, we're going to ride this out. And I guess even early this year when the struggles were happening online, we mentioned like, again, nothing concrete coming from behind closed doors or anything, but like the wheels could start to get turning in regards to, do we have to have these conversations of potentially making a roster change. Um, so that is, it is interesting to see. It will be interesting to see how this tournament affects FaZe. I do, in all regards, expect FaZe to not repeat last year's showing at champs, and I do think they should be in a good position to make a good run. They do have a pretty tough first round matchup on paper, and optic, but end of the day, it's only an 18 tournament, so um, that there really aren't many what you would consider a free win. Some people might argue against that in regards to Carolina's recent form, or I guess maybe even Boston in some regard, but um, FaZe has played well against Optic this year, but it's still, end of the day, it's champs and anything can happen. And I think, that we saw the quote unquote anything can happen. We saw that last year with FaZe at champs, because I don't think anybody was expecting FaZe to have a top six finish at champs last year. So, um, it is, I guess, to round it out too, like, you kind of, mentioned the whole dynamic there of like players playing for stats or whatever, and you're referring to potentially the narrative around Dashy or whatnot. I feel like even though he has seen the success, I feel like there are still some people who question Celium's play style and um, the impact it has for the team. I disagree with that sentiment very wholeheartedly. I think that just the at least the phase trio of Simp, Celium, and Abizi, they know how to work well together. And if it feels like Celium is playing for stats, then that might be your take, but at the end of the day, it does work. And I think even beyond that, it works importantly in search, which
Yeah.
at the end of the day, stats don't matter in search. But you have the Abizi player running in headfirst, being that looking for first bloods, that sort of player. You got Simp following him up behind with SMG, but you need that sort of statue AR player to be that like backline guy if you have those tiny terrors running in ahead of you. So I think even beyond like just looking at it from a stat base, like the play styles, they know they have the chemistry, they know how to work well together. So I disagree with, even if there is like an actual conversation around that in regard to Celium. Um, but I do think from a very, basic standpoint, like Celium and Draza, like them being the guys with one ring as opposed to Simp and Abuzi with two, it is an interesting conversation because I feel like, you know, at least in regards to Atlanta, if things don't go well at the end of this year, there's always, when it's been the roster changes for this team, it's been the trio sticking in just a one person change. But how long can they continue to make that the decision? Like, when do they move beyond a one person change if they feel like they need to make a change? So um I think that's a little premature, but kind of ranted a little bit there. It is interesting though, just to see like that's what's on the line at champs from a very like basic standpoint. Like, you can win champs and everything's fine and dandy, or you have a lackluster showing, and then all of these questions can happen for all of these teams. I think even, a team like LAT, like if they struggle at champs, I think contractually they're stuck, because I believe Nate Shot said like we don't have to worry about anything contract wise until 2027. I believe there was a clip I saw, something like that. Um so like outside of that, like outside of contracts being the thing keeping teams together, like a lackluster champs showing can have as big of an impact on your future as actually hoisting the trophy at the end of the day.
Yeah, what you said about Salim is right on. Like, we're not the podcast to ask because we both think he's one of the best COD players of his generation. Certainly, currently, I think we both said he was the runner up for MVP this season. So that kind of shows, and he's been like in the top 3 or top 5 MVP conversation basically since the CDL started. Like, he wasn't basically the last 3 or 4 years. That has been where he's lingered around for MVP. Another player I think in the same vein as Celium is Hydra, where going from 1 to 2 is really, really important for these players. Like, I saw a tweet and it was about a similar conversation. It was about Hydra specifically, and it made me mad when I read it. But I think it could be an interesting conversation in general, because it kind of is related to what we're talking about here. But the tweet was, Hydra is closer to being the CDL GOAT than Simp, Shotzi, Kenny, etc. 5 major wins across 3 different teams and 2 different orgs is insane. And this was a quote tweet to Breaking Point. They put out the CDL major wins by team, and FaZe had 7, Thieves 4, NYSL 3, Ultra 3, Optic 2, Minnesota Surge, and LAG all have 1 each. And of course, if you're looking at NYSL, then Hydra has all 3 of those major wins. And then he has 2 of those for LAT as well, because of the 2 this year. So he has 5 major titles, which I think this person was just saying that he has 5. FaZe over an entire the CDL has 7. It's not including the home series, I believe, in 2020. I could be mistaken on that, but I believe that this is just when majors were introduced, and then plus champs, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it's just majors, but either way, the conversation is like, is Hydra closer to the CDL GOAT than Simp, Shotzi, Kenny, etc.? He is not closer than Simp. I would say he's not closer than Shotzi. I think he's better than Kenny, but I would not put him above Kenny in an all-time list. If he were to get to 2, though, right? That's kind of like where I'm going with this. If he gets 2 rings, Simp has 2 rings, Shotzi has 2 rings, Kenny has 2 rings. Hydra would have a season MVP in 2023. He would have another probably top 3 finish in MVP voting this season. He has potentially, he could get champs MVP, because that's always open, and 2 rings on top of that. He's definitely in the top 10 probably at that point. I think it's one of those deals, and I don't know where you sit on this matter of like the talent is better than the resume, even if the resume is really really good. And that's how I felt about Simp for a really long
Yeah.
time. Like his resume is great. Like if you're just going by the resume, he has like a top 10, like you said, at worst top 15 resume. But then you look at the skill and you look at like how good he actually is, and you're like, oh, he's actually like probably one of the most talented players to ever play Call of Duty. And I think Hydra has that kind of potential. It's not like that's not a groundbreaking, um, declaration because we've been talking about this kid since even before he came to America. So, what do you think about this whole Hydra? And to link it back to Celium, like if Celium were to get to, and with the accolades and the skill that we know he has, where does that kind of put them?
I do think the Hydra's an interesting one. If he does get to uh, two rings, I kind of have the similar mindset of you. Like he seems like a player that even if he doesn't get that second ring this year or ever, like he's always going to be remembered just if, for how incredibly talented he was, regardless. And that's going to be something that that probably, again, if he doesn't get that second ring, like that probably helps him on some all time lists just because of how insane he is, for lack of a better term. I do think it is important to remember though that like, at a bare minimum, as it stands right now, he's the only EU player with a ring. So like I think it's not even close to say that he's the greatest European Call of Duty
No,
player of all
it's
time.
no offense to Bance, like, and
That's
he
what,
he
yeah.
held the mantle after Tommy,
Yep.
and Swanee I think had like the highest
Yep.
potential for a long time, but like I don't know how many event wins Bance has in his career. I would wager to say that Hydra probably has more already, at least
No.
at the major level, not like
Yeah.
in total,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah. Yeah.
like but yeah, like Hydra has 5 major wins. He has champs. Like he's undoubtedly the best European player, and he's by far the most talented.
So I think, and that could very much change. The landscape in the CDL is changing. We have these, you know, the Miami team with all Spanish roster. We have potentially some more European or French talent coming in with gentlemates over the years. So like that conversation could change if Hydra's career literally ended. But I think we're both of the mind that Hydra's only going to continue to rack up the accolades and tournament titles and whatnot. So it seems like, at a bare minimum, he has set the floor for his career as greatest European player of all time. It's just stacking on top of that. And then how does he, fit into the, all time Call of Duty list for all players in the world? Um, it could be the recency bias here speaking, but if LAT win this event, I do think there would be some people who would potentially put Hydra above Abizi in an all-time list. I don't think I would agree with that, and I do think that would be greatly impacted by the recency bias. But it would be a three-peat and 3 straight events. They would both have 2 rings. Um, so we can revisit that after champs, but I wouldn't put Hydra above Simp just yet. I do think that that's taking it a bit far in the context of the tweet you mentioned. Um, but I mean, again, end of the day, that just shows just how much this champ stuff means and how big of an impact it truly can have. In regards to Celium, I would probably have to think a little harder, but I do know like some of these players that, at least in the 2 ring category, like Aches, I love Aches. I love, what he meant for the Call of Duty community and everything like that. Arcity's JCap, I guess you would count Kenny as an AR for his 2 rings, but like those are the AR players with 2 rings. I think most people would probably say Celium is the most talented AR player out of those guys. I think some old heads might argue like prime JCap, and that's like, BO1 JCap
Yeah.
basically, and even before he was winning the rings. Um, but I think that could at least, it'd be at least a conversation, whether you agree or not. And I don't even know if I agree, but it's something that would be talked about, at least in regards to Celium if he does get a second ring. But at the same time, then if Celium gets a second ring, Draza's getting a second ring. So then where does Draza fit into that conversation too? Very interesting topics there. This is the fun of this legacy talk, and these are things I wasn't even thinking about really talking heading into this show, and we're already talking about it. And that's just the fun of it.
Let's just clean up the one ring conversation real quick because uh, we've already talked about Hydra, we've talked about Celium, um, we've talked a little bit about Dashy, but like Envoy, Draza, Dashy, Hook, Slasher, these are players that also have one ring going into this event. I think we both think it is a uber long shot that Slasher gets number two here, but
Hey, I think people thought it was an uber long shot. Eights would get number two at World War II
yeah,
champs too. So
but if he were to get that, then like his you just listed off the best ARs or some of the best ARs in COD history, obviously not including Octane and Formal because they each have one. But if Slasher would get two, then we're having different conversations. We're also having a lot different conversation in general because this would be the most unpredictable champs winner of all time, even far surpassing Optic last year or I don't denial. No, denial was really good going into that champs, but I don't know who else would even qualify at that
it would
point.
be EG World War
Yeah,
II.
and EG was also kind of like ramping it up at the end. Like people said, like no, they're going to be really good, in the practices leading up to champs. So this would be a pretty incredible turnaround. I don't see it happening. I don't think you do either. It is interesting to think about Hook, Dashy, Draza, and Envoy though. Envoy is going to get about as little credit as one could probably get, probably along with Draza in this case if he were to win his second ring. Dashy would get a lot of credit, I would imagine, because he's definitely going to drop numbers and like he's one of the more talented AR players. He's another player that would be in that conversation of like, is he the best AR player of all time if he gets his second ring? Hook, his legacy completely changes, I think.
I was just gonna, yeah.
Like his career is weird. Like if you look at his team history, like to win the first CDL champs and then the stuff that happened the next 2 or so years, he's kind of in the wilderness. He started this season in challengers. He gets benched, brought back, or yeah, he got released, I think, outright. He gets released by Optic
Yeah,
for
yeah,
a
yeah.
guy that he replaced in the first place, and then replaces him again. If he were to win champs, where where does that kind of put Hook in all of this conversation? Nade Shot tweet notwithstanding, where he said that Hook was like one of the most talented players of all time.
You stole exactly what I was gonna say. That was literally what I was like. Hook wins his second ring, and he like completely changes the narrative around his entire career. And I do think, it's different depending on what era of COD fandom you're in. For people like us, like saying something like who could be considered one of the greatest of all time, that feels like a, foregone conclusion. Like if you were to tell me that 10 years ago, I'm like, yeah, this kid's freaking nasty. Like obviously that's where he's gonna end up. But he's obviously dealt with a lot, gone through a lot, and it hasn't all gone according to plan. If he does get that second ring, that's what I was thinking as you were talking, is the nade shot tweet of like, Hook is paraphrasing here, but it was along the lines of like Hook is a player that doesn't come around very often, and if you get the chance to acquire him, you don't pass that up. Essentially, what it was. And he like he gets that second ring, that's he solidifies that conversation, and that's where his name, I already think, even if he doesn't get a second ring ever in COD, like he's already considered one of the best Call of Duty, one of the best FPS players of all time, just because he did have that success in Halo as well. Obviously, if you're gonna have that conversation, like Formal's number one far and away, but then like Hook is at least mentioned in that regard. Same with Shotzi because of Shotzi's success in both. But like Hook is, he might not be at the very top of that list, but he's at least mentioned, and um, I think that only is solidified further with a second ring. I think it's it's going to be tough for Optic, but stranger things have happened, and I think if Optic did win champs this year, I would be most happy for Hook, especially you laid it out perfectly. Like dude was literally in challengers to start this year, potentially not even on a CDL team. And then he's gone through a lot even this year in terms of getting picked up by Optic when it felt like before that he was dominating challengers and it was going to be a question of what team does he get a chance on. It felt like it might be a bottom of the barrel team. And then he was going to go through the cycle of like, potentially struggling on that team and having to deal with all that, yada, yada. Gets the Optic chance, dropped by Optic, gets picked back up. Like, it's been a roller coaster. And I would be really happy for him if Optic were able to get the job done.
Is there
Yeah.
anybody else that you think is of notable or honorable mention to either have a ton to gain or a ton to lose at Champs 2025?
I think we kind of glossed over it just because you just mentioned it, but Envoy is an interesting one just because, like you said, like I feel like um, if they do get the job done here, it would be like he would almost be like an afterthought, it feels
Yeah.
like, and he would be someone who has two rings. So that is an interesting conversation there. I do think Slasher, you mentioned it in general. I think the bigger thing um, with him, regardless of exactly how Carolina plays at this event, is just a question of is this the last time we ever see Slasher compete? Um, the likely answer is no, just because I think even if Carolina struggle at champs, they'll at least have that roster at EWC. But they did make a change last year at the end of the year when Beans played at EWC. So it's not out of the question that this could potentially be Slasher's last event. If it's not, it could be his second to last event. I hope it's not. I think he seems to be the guy. He's got his robotics degree and whatever. He seemingly knows what he's gonna do after life in competitive COD ends, and I think he's gonna want to extend his career as long as he can. And I still think he's a pretty solid player. So I just think that's is this the last hurrah for Slasher is just a question in general, regardless of the placing at champs. And yeah, I don't think there's really anybody else outside of these guys that we mentioned. It is, 22 players don't have a ring. I think the one of the 22 there is Scrap already uh, labeled that and outlined all that. Four of the 8 teams at champs, Boston, Miami, Vancouver, and Toronto, don't have any champs winners. So if one of those teams somehow pulled something off at champs, we would get 4 completely new uh, ring bearers in COD esports. And I do think of that list, Vancouver is very interesting. Just kind of, what I mentioned earlier there when we were talking about the lack of marketing or whatever. I guess brings us a little full circle. Is just like we don't know what to expect from Vancouver because it's been so long since we last saw them in action. And if Vancouver does get like a last place finish at champs here, does that like completely invalidate everything they did earlier this year with the magical run they went on after getting Neptune in the squad? So I do think that's an interesting conversation, I guess, to the same degree. Something else to keep in mind, the quote unquote home court advantage or, home field cheese, however you want to phrase it. Event's not technically in Toronto, but it's a home event for Toronto Ultra in most people's eyes. Is that something here where Toronto gets the job done in Canada, similar to Optic getting the the champs win in Texas last year. I guess that's something else to keep an eye on too.
Yeah, and then we can complain about it after the fact because that happened. Um, I think Miami would be very interesting if they were to win. Of course, it just any of these teams winning is interesting in its own right, but if an all European team were to win champs and this specific all European team, which did not really seem to have a lot of life during like the major two qualifiers at major two, it just felt like they kind of ran their course. We thought super highly of Real, still do.
Yep.
Super has been a revelation this season. Rincourt, we've talked about it, probably going to win Rookie of the Year or definitely going to be one of the finalists, the top two or top three. But again, like going back to the all European thing, like they would be on the very short list of EU players to win champs and then to do it together, to do it as an all Spanish team. It's pretty, like, it'd be a pretty ridiculous outcome. I don't see it happening. Again, we've talked about like how likely we think some of these champs winners are. They're in the we have no clue what they're gonna do. But I think of the somewhat, um, I guess, realistic champs. Like I wouldn't say it's likely or anything, but somewhat realistic. They'd have like among the craziest champs win.